Good. So we're pleased today to have Dr. Jeff Bielicki with us. He runs the Energy Sustainability Research Laboratory, where his students and research is around energy and environmental systems and policy interact, specifically on topics related to carbon management, renewable energy, and the energy and water nexus. Dr. Bielicki collaborates with researchers in academia and the U.S. Department of Energy's national laboratories and numerous disciplines. We're happy to have him and Marcus Miranda today to talk on a very interesting topic, and I'll just turn it over to Dr. Bielicki.
Great, thanks, Gwen, and everybody. We appreciate the invitation to join you to talk about this work. What we're going to talk about is our assessment of a method that was developed within our Department of Civil, Environmental, and Geodetic Engineering here at Ohio State that can simultaneously remediate coal mine drainage while extracting rare earth elements from it. And rare earth elements are things like yttrium, that are essential for modern electronics and computers and so on. The United States does not have large deposits of these rare earth elements. And in fact, we rely on places like China. I believe we get upwards of 80% of our demand for these elements, these rare earth elements from China, which can cause some geopolitical tensions. One way you can visualize this is that when the tariffs were being implemented in the prior presidential administration, none of them touched rare earth elements, and so the Department of Energy has a major interest in pushing forward other means to economically procure these rare earth elements and through domestic supply chains. And our colleagues have developed this trap, extract, precipitate process, which is now patented to extract these from coal mine drainage, the water that seeps out of abandoned coal mines, and in the process remediate it and reduce its acidity and clean up those waters. So Marcos is going to present on the paper that he led that was published, I believe, sometime middle to end of last year. The timeline was long through all the publication, peer review, and all that. I can't remember exactly when it went live, but Marcos is going to talk about our techno-economic and life cycle assessment, and there's some of the processes is sprinkled throughout that, and I'll be happy to take any questions after that. I'll add that the main architect of the process, Jason Chan, has left Ohio State and now works for a National Engine Technology Lab contractor. I don't believe he was able to join us. So if you have any specific questions about the process and the experiments, we can work to answer those after the talk. Marcos, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeff. I do need permission to share my screen, sorry.
So hopefully, okay, yeah, you got it.
Yeah, cool. Now, can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so hi everyone. My name is Marcus Miranda. I am a student of Professor Jeffrey Bielicki here at Ohio State, and I'm going to talk to you all a little bit about basically using industrial byproducts to address the legacy of coal use here in Ohio specifically, but hopefully generally applicable in other locations as well. So there is a bit of a problematic legacy from domestic coal use, and that is coal mine drainage. It comes from abandoned mine lands that contributes to environmental degradation, and it currently affects over 20,000 kilometers of waterways throughout the U.S. every year. And it's a pretty big environmental problem identified by the U.S. EPA. Coal mine drainage, in case you're not aware of what it is kind of characterized by having a pH between 2.5 and 6, has large concentrations of metals, including boron, aluminum, nickel, arsenic, which can be pretty hazardous for ecotoxicity, aquatic toxicity, things like that, as well as just getting into our drinking water and things like that. But something that could be useful is they're also known to have relatively high concentrations of rare earth elements for rare earth elements. So anywhere between 560 nanograms per liter to over 2,600 or close to 2,600 micrograms per liter for rare earth elements. That can be pretty good in terms of concentrations. And so one avenue is looking at, can we maybe extract and concentrate those rare earth elements from this coal mine drainage? But again, focusing on this problematic legacy of domestic coal use, another issue that we have is the production of byproducts, such as stabilized flue gas desulfurization material. It's a byproduct from removing sulfur dioxide from flue gas. Back in 2014, I believe they were generating around like 35 million tons of it per year. It can be landfilled. There are other alternative uses in concrete manufacturing and drywall manufacturing, but it is pH dependent. So it depends on the amount of lime that's present, how much lime that you introduce into it, its use, and whether it can be landfilled or used for construction equipment. However, use has lagged behind production, so we're producing more than what we can actually use in concrete and drywall manufacturing and other uses. So there's a need for other alternative uses. The other issue that we kind of face with stabilized flue gas desulfurization material, or SFGD, is that with a number of coal plants, projected to go offline in the coming years, they have large stores and reserves of this material on site that they need to figure out what they're going to do with that end of life. And so there is a need for figuring out, are they just going to landfill all of this, or are there other uses they can have? And that will be coming, again, as I said, over the next couple of years as a number of coal plants go offline. And so kind of with this context, some researchers here at Ohio State University basically designed a coal mine drainage treatment system that was based off of using this stabilized flue gas desulfurization material. And I'll kind of give you a little overview of how it would conceivably work. So you have this abandoned mine land site that we want to reclaim later on that's producing this coal mine drainage. And we would basically build a retention wall that would then divert the coal mine drainage into these passive remediation cells. And what this passive remediation cell basically means is that we're running the coal mine drainage through them without using any additional power or electricity. So there's no need for motors, generators, or anything like that. There's no need for any other chemical or reagent inputs. Basically, once you build the system, you can leave it alone and let it operate. And so we have these geotextile membranes that would run through and allow the coal mine drainage to percolate through the treatment cell, and the treatment cell would work on extracting those elements I was talking about earlier, like boron and arsenic and nickel. It would also work on removing the rare earth elements, which we could later extract. And so we wanted to conduct a life cycle and techno-economic assessment of this, basically to see what are the environmental impacts and what are the costs that we're expecting to be associated with this system. And I will pause here. I will say I can't see the Zoom right now. So if you guys have questions, just feel free to interrupt me and I'll be happy to answer them along the way. But moving on, as we're thinking about this life cycle system and analysis, there were some pretty important questions that we needed to answer to see, hey, like, how are we going to do this here? And the biggest one was, how do we account for removing harmful elements from the water? We basically want to quantify this removal, but we don't want to imply that we're producing water. And so one of the ways that we worked around this was we used a products avoided feature in CIMAPRO. And CIMAPRO is an internationally used life cycle assessment tool, essentially, that allows you to construct these systems and then execute the life cycle assessment, and it gives you the results from it. And so in SimulaPro, we basically used our bench scale experiments to determine the amount of species removal. So how much metal arsenic was coming in based off of how much arsenic was coming out. And we use those as the proposed avoided amounts in SimulaPro. The next kind of important consideration about the life cycle assessment was we used two methods for assessing our impacts or determining our impacts, and they were Tracy and Recipe. And these were our two assessment methods. So Tracy was developed by the US EPA. It was designed to provide a better insight from like a chemistry perspective of your impacts, how the chemicals are going to impact the waterways and contribute to environmental health burdens or anything like that. But it only provides what we call midpoint indicators, not endpoint indicators. And that's where Recipe came in. Recipe is an internationally used impact assessment method, but it provides these weights that develops these endpoint indicators in 3 key categories, which makes it very simple, very nice, very kind of more straightforward to understand, but it also allows you to more directly compare your system to others. It's not a perfect comparison because of all the assumptions that are inherent in doing a life cycle assessment, but allows for a more direct comparison. And so I'll show you all kind of the process and system boundary of what we included and what we didn't. So everything in that gray dash box was included in our life cycle and techno-economic assessment. We assumed that, coal mining, coal combustion at a plant, those things would continue regardless of if we design the system. So they're excluded from our system boundary. And we also didn't account for, building of the actual products that use the rare earth elements. So looking at camera lenses, magnets, hard drives, like LCD screens, computer parts and components, things like that. So we didn't account for that either. But we accounted for everything else, including the production of the chemicals we would need during our extraction process, building of the sites themselves, and everything in between. And so I want to start by focusing on the passive treatment cell that I first presented on. And I just want to look at that from a life cycle perspective. So using Tracy, we can see our treatment cell process contributions. So there are a lot of negative impacts, which are the red, that are occurred during the construction of the treatment cell, coming from the machinery and equipment we're using, the energy we're using, and things like that. But we also see these benefits from removing the heavy metals and other elements from our coal mine drainage waters. And so there's a bit of an offset of the damages to non-carcinogenic and ecotoxicity from this passive treatment cell. And I think it'd be important to note that this is a process contribution. So these are what I'm presenting here aren't like the numbers. This is just how much of each is contributing to these impact categories. So we see 100% of the impacts to acidification come from construction. Again, that equipment, those materials and things we're using there. And what was interesting, and I think good that we saw, was that these findings were supported when we looked at these impacts from a recipe point of view as well. And so we can see again for ecosystem on the left and for human health on the right that we're seeing similar contributions from the passive treatment cell offsetting these impacts in these key areas, kind of saying like, hey, so this passive treatment cell is actually doing something good for us by removing these harmful elements from the coal mine drainage waters. And so that was really encouraging to us. And so that was just the treatment cell. We're going to now move and start talking about rare earth elements in general and the larger picture. So kind of as Professor Bielicki indicated, there is an international dependence for rare earth elements. It's used in a broad range of everyday products. Global production was estimated to be over 200,000 tons of rare earth oxide equivalents. And that was back in 2019, which was an 11% increase from 2018. So that demand or use, I can only imagine, has grown since then. And more domestically, why that matters to us is that we imported 100% of our rare earth element demand from international sources between 2015 and 2018. Now, as Professor Bielicki also said, there is that has since shifted and changed, but we're still getting more than 80% of our rare earth elements from international sources. And so there's been a lot of drive or emphasis in saying, where can we find sources of these rare earth elements domestically here in the US? And so that's where this entire system comes in. We've focused now up until now on just the passive treatment cell, but I want to broaden this out now and include the entire system and look at the entire system from a life cycle perspective, as well as a techno-economic perspective, and say, like, what are the costs associated with this? And so to start, I'm going to give you guys just a quick background on the bench scale experiments that are informing our results. So for the extraction side, basically we're assuming a system that generates around 400 liters of extract per day. That requires 13 kilograms of SFGD material, 400 liters of 0.3 molar citrate solution, and 13 kilograms of sodium dithionite. This then feeds the extraction basin, then feeds into an aeration basin, which is divided only into 2 batches. So those 400 liters were divided into 4 batches. Now we're bringing it to 2 batches to aerate the solution before it then moves to sedimentation, so we can extract the rare earth elements on a dried weight percentage. The energy balance perspective we have is that the extraction basin requires 45 kilowatts per day of electricity, and the aeration basin requires 54 kilowatts per day of electricity. This current design, again, because it is a bench scale experiment, only produces 323 grams of rare earth elements per year. That is not, like, again, to scale or anything. That is exact specifically for this bench scale experiment. And so with that in mind, when we're looking at the overall system, including this extraction, aeration, sedimentation step, from a life cycle perspective, what we can see is that the benefits that we had in ecosystem impacts from the passive treatment cell are kind of lost once we have the more reagent, or the more what's the word I'm looking for? The more demanding extraction part, in terms of we need chemicals, we're going to need electricity and things like that. All of those are contributing, and so we lose the benefits that we acquired from the passive treatment cell. But what we can do is then identify where in the process are we gaining most of our impacts from. And what we saw was most of them were gained from reagent use, chemical use that we needed for the extraction process itself, as well as the current sources of energy generation. And so then when we look at the system, the whole thing from a techno-economic perspective, we can see that the treatment cell itself is going to cost us around $16,000 in 2018 USD. That includes the construction, labor, and machinery. We wanted to minimize transportation distances by having the coal mine drainage source located close to the SFGD source, close to our treatment cell, trying to keep everything relatively close. And so we were able to assume that. When we add in the chemical extraction of the rare earth elements now, you can see that the capital costs are around $44,000 in 2018 USD, while the operation and maintenance for each year is around $82,000 in 2018 USD. This will account for equipment and labor, construction. It also includes the chemicals and the electricity that we're purchasing, as well as administrative costs like taxes, insurance, things like that. And so this brings us to a levelized cost of rare earth elements to $280 per gram of total rare earth elements, with an interest rate of 10% in a lifetime of 20 years. Again, I stress that this is for a bench scale system. So take all of these results with a grain of salt, as we assumed a much smaller system, and we don't know how that could change in the future. But I'll go over some key takeaways now. Basically, you can see on the left the recipe treatment cell endpoint indicators that I was referring to. Negative numbers are good. We like those. We don't want positive numbers. Positive numbers means they're contributing to the impacts themselves. So you can see from the treatment cell, we have negative overall results for the human health and ecosystem. That's really good. We want that. So we can see that there's a benefit to human ecosystem health. We're removing toxic elements from coal mine drainages. It'll help mitigate the need for downstream efforts to remediate or clean the waters. And it can improve local water quality and local environmental health. It also presents alternative uses for industrial byproducts. So we're no longer landfilling that SFGD material that requires land, energy. The impacts on the environment are unknown. It also prevents further degradation of land near the facilities. And there is a way to turn this into a potential additional revenue stream for these plants, especially those that are looking at end of life and decommissioning and have this giant store of SFGD material that they need to determine what to do with. So for the future, we could incorporate an uncertainty analysis. There's variability in rare earth element pricing. Their values change annually, so you can include an uncertainty in that. It is also a relatively young technology. As I've been stressing, this was bench scale experiments, so we don't know how this technology would or could scale, and so that's something we could also try and project. And there needs to be some verification on our end of the chemical extraction equipment prices, essentially talking to actual vendors and things like that to verify that these price estimates are accurate. From the life cycle assessment perspective, some key areas where we could improve on the system design is on the chemicals or reagents we're using to extract the rare earth elements and where we're getting the energy from. I made it so that it was an Ohio specific mix of electricity from 2018. And so this mix kind of accounted for some of the solar and wind penetration, but energy still accounted for 11% of our total operation and maintenance costs. That was our third highest cost. And the chemicals that we needed kind of for 21% of our operation and maintenance costs. That's our second highest cost. The primary highest cost being the individual we have working the facility. And so those are two key areas that both the life cycle assessment and the Techno-Economic Assessment both identified as needing to be updated or could be improved upon in the system design. I'd like to take a quick moment to acknowledge our funding and support here, and I'll leave you all with this takeaway slide, and I'm ready for any questions you may have.
All right, thank you, Marcos. That was very good. So I'm going to open up for questions, and if you don't mind, I would like to start. Just kind of curious, like typically, you did mention China mining these rare earth elements. So how do they typically extract it? And is it the geology of the area that just has them in higher concentrations?
Yeah, great question. So I believe there's some other locations, I want to say in South or Central America as well. Typically how rare earth elements are achieved is by giant like open pit mines that are very, very not good for the environment. And so it's usually like the rock that you have in those locations, or those locations that are just high in concentrations of these rare earth elements, and so they're easily mineable. And then you can concentrate them because they're in such high concentrations. I can't speak to the exact concentration of the minerals or the elements in that area, but that is usually how they're achieved, is those big mines, essentially.
Yeah, it's
I'll-
interesting. I was gonna say, I just looked up where in the world they are, and like 57% are either in China or Vietnam, which is interesting to me, and another 10% in Russia.
Yeah, countries we don't necessarily have the greatest relationships with right now. I'll add, so they are present in coal seams, as you know, by virtue of them leaching out into the water after you remove the pumps, and they fill up with the abandoned mines fill up with water. I'll add another component of this is, the extraction processes in China and elsewhere tend to have a lot of negative environmental consequences. They don't have the same sort of regulations that we have around how they go about mining. In addition, there's concerns about worker safety and worker health, and some of the social considerations about how the mining proceeds, that if we are to develop domestic supply chains of it, we would have our regulations protecting workers and so on, governing these as well. It's not something we can easily monetize or quantify, but there's these other benefits from a more social standpoint.
Okay. Well, hey, thank you, Marcos. That does answer my question. Other questions for Marcos or even Jeff?
Just curious where your locations for this work is.
So we took data from locations in and around Ohio, but there is no specific location for actual siting of the facility or anything like that. We use data again specific to waters here in Ohio. I can't remember off the top of my head what was the two that we used the most. I can look that up and send it to you if you're interested. But yeah, again, it was designed to be Ohio specific, but not specifically a location in Ohio.
I believe that Jason and Turingent collected water from 22 sites throughout Ohio. So, you know, the experiments are based on actual coal mine drainage. And was it Raccoon Creek? Am I remembering that correctly? That these
It sounds correct as one of them.
Yeah. So the experiments, I think, had waters from, they focused on waters from 2 sites, Raccoon Creek, I believe, being one of them. In terms of,
isn't that up in on 22, like in Pennsylvania, just over the line there? Or am I thinking something else? But okay. No, that's okay. That's okay.
Jason did all the driving. We can, but yeah, I think, I think one of the reasons that had one of the higher amounts of rare earths in it when it was characterized. I can pull up the paper while Marcos is filibustering to determine what the actual locations were.
So does that have to do with depth at all? I mean, do you guys look at that?
No, I don't think depth really plays too much into it. It's kind of as Jeff alluded to, it's like relative to the coal seams here and like the concentrations there. There are other locations in the US where the concentration of rare earth elements in the coal seams are much higher. So the waters leaking out of those, you would have higher concentrations of rare earth elements that, might be more favorable or desirable for extracting rare earth elements there in those locations.
So in that sulfur byproduct, that was something else I was wondering about. Is that what they typically call fly ash that comes out of the coal mines?
Mm-hmm. That gypsum.
Okay, yeah. And didn't I mean, I think this is right, but I'm just not sure. But it's pretty inert stuff, right? So I've heard they actually built trails and stuff from that product.
Yeah, they with the right lime addition, it can be pretty neutral or even slightly basic. And so yeah, like I said, there's a lot of different applications. Cement manufacturing and drywall manufacturing were just 2. I know they have a lot of uses in construction, but the amount that is produced annually is just so much that we can't use enough of it. And so if you have some like fly ash or gypsum that has a high enough pH, it's perfect for kind of neutralizing acidic waters, which is what coal mine drainage is, and that's why we want to use it.
Okay. All right. Other questions?
Not uncommon to see those, drywall companies right next to the coal-fired power plants along the Ohio River for sure, Dan.
Well, yeah, and I'll be getting some drywall work done in a couple weeks, so I'll remember that while they're working. I'll ask them about that. Maybe. Okay. Other questions?
The fascinating topic. Thank you both.
Yeah. No, it's very, very, very interesting.
I put in the chat that the experiments are based on Flint Run.
Okay. Now, for some reason, I think Raccoon Creek to me it sounds so familiar, but I might be off a little bit.
Dan, I believe it's in Athens County, and I think they've been doing quite a bit of remediation work on that. So I guess one of my questions is, well, what you're attempting to do and some of the remediation work that's already being done in that area, how will you collaborate with those folks?
Yeah, so I'll take a first stab at it, and then Jeff can evaluate my response. But the treatment cell that we designed in the first half of this kind of works well with remediation efforts here. Again, because it's stopping the run of coal mine drainage, just like neutralizing the waters before they enter the Ohio waters. But something that we didn't really talk about in the paper here, but a proposed use of that SFGD material, like once you've it's been spent, it can't capture any more rare earth elements or elements. You remove it, you process it to extract those rare earth elements, but that material you can use to backfill these abandoned mine lands, because essentially, as long as they're open, as long as they're kind of exposed, they're going to continue to generate these waters, these coal mine drainage waters. And by backfilling them and kind of sealing them back up to where they were before they were mined and exposed, that's kind of how you eventually stop the generation of the waters. Otherwise, they continue kind of indefinitely. And so I see like there's the potential for a lot of overlap with other efforts, depending on what those efforts are specifically. But I think the end goal is to really stop the coal mine drainage waters.
Well, that sounds like an excellent collaboration. Thanks.
So Marcus, one more question. The like GAW piles. Does that fit into your model at all, or does it have to be actual water drainage from the mines?
I'm gonna go with the actual drainage from the mines.
Okay.
I think there are those as well, but I think this focuses on just like the leaking waters through those abandoned mine lands more than the piles themselves.
Because I know in the past people have talked about rare earth elements in those gob piles, but it just sounds like the system that you have in place was pretty specific to the water drainage.
Yeah. There's a few approaches to remediating the drainage, and this is a passive approach that relies on the natural percolation of the water as it's flowing. So there's no pumping really. So I think that's where Marcos is coming from. I mean, there will be rare earths in other legacy aspects of coal mining and so on. But here, this particular process and system design depends on the natural flow and percolation of the waters.
I know that the GAW piles have been discussed by the Department of Energy, Dan, and other programs that I've been on, that, they're considering those, looking at them. And to Myra's point, it looks like it's Jackson and Athens County area and the Raccoon Creek watershed. That's where he had the Raccoon Creek top of mind.
Yeah, Raccoon Creek's a state, it's a state park up in Pennsylvania. So I was like, okay. All right, that wrong raccoon. Okay.
And like I mentioned, this work is part of a larger funded effort by the Department of Energy, where, as I mentioned, they collected samples from 22 different sites and assessed them and so on. We just chose to do this cost and environmental assessment on a hypothetical but presumably realistic system that would be installed at Flint Run.
It's interesting that some of the research I did just in preparation for this talks about, like you said, Jeff, not just, only the global perspective of it, but also the importance of it to national security. These are used in so many things that our military, is creating using those processes with, whether it's missiles or satellites or. So interesting topic related to the global perspective.
Yeah. I guess that's it for questions. Thank you both so much. Very informative, very, very good project. I can see very beneficial to to the world, really. I mean, not just the United States.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. We should also add that, you know, I'm sure you get Tarun Butalia is probably no stranger to you guys. So this is, and him and Jason Cheng have worked for decades on various aspects of coal mining and legacies and so on. And this is a part of their, you know, ongoing work. We were happy to be invited to do this sort of assessment on this process that they had been working on.
Thank you again. Thank you both.
Yep. Thank you.
Right. I'm going to stop the recording.